On behalf of the Socialist Equality Party, I'd like to welcome all of you here today. My name is Linda Tenenbaum. I'm a member of the Socialist Equality Party's National Committee, and I'll be chairing today's event. The aim of this rally, which is being live streamed around the world, and of the SEP's March 10th rally in Melbourne, is to continue and broaden the fight to free courageous journalist, publisher, and Australian citizen Julian Assange. Our speakers this afternoon will be SEP National Secretary James Cogan, Professor Stuart Rees from the University of Sydney, Joe Laurier, Editor-in-Chief of Consortium News, based in the United States, Oscar Grenfell, the National Convener of the International Youth and Students for Social Equality, and as our final speaker, journalist and filmmaker, acclaimed journalist and filmmaker, John Pilger. I'd like to begin with a few introductory remarks. Julian Assange is a journalist who has put his life on the line to tell the truth to the world, to lift the veil of lies and deception and expose the violence, conspiracies and crimes committed by the US government and its allies, including Australia, above all through their brutal and ongoing neo-colonial wars of the past nearly 30 years. Julian has been held for nearly 7 years in what the United Nations Working Group on Arbitrary Detention has ruled constitutes a deprivation of liberty and a violation of his human rights. For much of the past year, and many of you will know this, while holed up in a tiny room in the Ecuadorian embassy in London, barred from any physical or social contact with the outside world, Julian has been denied even the right to communicate via telephone or internet. His health is deteriorating, and he faces the constant threat of extradition to the United States, where he could face charges that, if found guilty, could attract the death penalty. Neither the Morrison government, the Turnbull government before it, the Labor government before that, nor any of the establishment parties has lifted a finger in his defence. Just by virtue of attending this rally today, you have already taken a significant stand against the campaign of lies and slanders concocted to vilify Assange and blacken his name, along with the global wall of political and media censorship erected in order to deepen his isolation from his many millions of supporters and undermine his vital work. Almost 9 months ago, the Socialist Equality Party's first rally to free Julian Assange demanded of the then Turnbull government that it exercise its diplomatic powers and indisputable legal discretion to secure his relief and allow him to return home. Turnbull and his government did nothing, confident that not a single media outlet or parliamentarian would raise a voice in opposition. Today, we are again demanding of the Australian government, now the Morrison government, that it insist that the British government allow Julian to leave the embassy as a free man, travel to the airport, and if he so wishes, board a plane to Australia with a transparent guarantee against both arrest in the United Kingdom and extradition to the United States. Julian has never been charged with any crime. He has an Australian passport. He is an Australian citizen, and as such, the Morrison government is duty-bound to defend his democratic rights and act to protect him from harm. And there are some notable precedents that I'd like to mention. 26-year-old Australian citizen David Hicks, for example, was arrested in Afghanistan in 2001 by US forces, falsely deemed a terrorist, then incarcerated in Guantanamo Bay for 5 years, where he was subjected to torture and solitary confinement. His father, Terry Hicks, conducted a powerful campaign to mobilise David's many supporters across the country and in the US, who were outraged at his treatment and the Howard government's filthy collaboration with Washington. It was this pressure from below that eventually forced David's release, just prior to the 2007 federal election. David's conviction on terror charges at Guantanamo Bay, at a Guantanamo Bay show trial, was later formally rescinded. Terry Hicks, his father, has written an endorsement of this rally, drawing important lessons from his own traumatic experience. He writes, "If Julian was a famous sports person and the government thought they could use him to promote their own international image, they would be bending over backwards to secure his release. But because they can't use him in this way and they follow whatever the US demands, they refuse to act." Terry continues, "You might get support from some high-profile people, but the fight to gain Julian's freedom depends on ordinary people speaking out. You will win them if you explain the basic issues at stake, such as freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and democratic rights, and you'll be respected for your determination and your honesty. Always remember," he advises, "that the story constantly alters for those who lie. But if you're telling the truth, then nothing changes, and the real story will eventually come out." Hear, hear. Terry concludes, "The Australian people have got to take a stand in defence of Julian Assange and understand that when they take up the struggle for his freedom, they are fighting to defend their own democratic rights." A second example. Peter Grester, the Australian Al Jazeera journalist, was jailed in Egypt in December 2013 and charged with falsifying news and having a negative impact on overseas perceptions of the country, that is Egypt, for exposing the Egyptian government's violence and horrific human rights abuses. He was convicted to 7 years, but he was freed after immense pressure was placed on Canberra by his family, his supporters, and thousands of ordinary people, in which the media joined, before the government finally acted. But the most recent case is that of Hakim Al-Arabi, a Bahraini-born refugee, Australian resident and footballer, recently imprisoned in Thailand after Bahrain sought his extradition, placing his life in danger. Again, a powerful, broad-based campaign was launched, led by well-known retired footballer, now TV commentator, sports commentator Craig Foster, to force the government to secure Al-Arabi's release from Thailand. The media enthusiastically participated, as did sporting groups, NGOs, trade unions, and the state and federal governments, along with hundreds of thousands of ordinary people in Australia, Thailand, and internationally. Australian Foreign Minister Marise Payne was forced eventually by this pressure to intervene. Bahrain dropped its extradition attempt and Al-Arabi flew back to Australia 3 weeks ago. Were the media, the unions, the Labor Party, the Greens, the civil liberties advocates, human rights groups, and individual journalists to discover some courage and play a similar role in the case of Julian Assange, raising their voices, refusing to be silenced, moving parliamentary motions, campaigning among, clarifying and fighting to engage ordinary people, not to speak of simply informing their readers of this rally today, the weak, divided, reactionary and very likely short-lived Morrison government would be forced to meet its political obligations to Assange and secure his release. Instead, there is, yet again, total silence, total blanket censorship. The voices of ordinary citizens are being muzzled, and the reason is clear. Julian Assange constitutes a threat, not only to the Australian government, but to every government. He has bravely published what they cover up daily, including their crimes, corruption and deceit, in order to remain in power. The critical issue here is what is to be done. We appeal to everyone here to turn to young people, the working class, and to all those who stand for the defence of fundamental democratic rights, because the fight to free Julian Assange and defend WikiLeaks is an essential part of the fight to defend the democratic and social rights of the entire working class.
Authorised by James Kogan for the Socialist Equality Party, Suite 906, 185 Elizabeth Street, Sydney, New South Wales 2000.